Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining from. It's great to see you here for this LinkedIn live event on how organizations can optimize their spend on software and save money. Uh, for the session today, we have a special guest from Trio who's going to share a novel and effective way of doing that, especially in the European region. We'll get into our introductions in a minute, but before we get going, I'd like to ask everyone to write in the chat window where you are listening in from, because we would just like to get a sense of where our audience is. And also, a quick note on how we would like to run this session today. We want to really make it as interactive as we possibly can. So throughout the session, we will take some pauses for questions, and we'll try to answer them live as well. Because it's not a typical webinar where there are a lot of slides that we'll be going through. So net, we really want to make it interactive. It would be great if you could start messaging us in terms of where you are based right now. Okay, let's get into some introductions next. My name is Rahul Gehani. I'm a partner with Everest Group, based in India, in the Delhi NCR region. Been with Everest Group for about 8 years, and overall have about 20 years experience in the technology and outsourcing industry. A good part of this experience has been in working very closely with the procurement, sourcing, and the vendor management departments of various organizations globally on how they can optimize their spend on software, hardware, cloud, IT services, BPO services, etc. Leonard, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation today. I'm very excited about what you can teach us today and what different approaches you have. And I've been in the pre-owned software business for almost 15 years now, but it kind of feels like that licensing never gets old. So I'm always open for new ideas and happy to learn and to share my knowledge as well today.
Great. Welcome, Leonard. Udit, you want to go next?
Sure, all. Thank you and welcome, Leonard. And hi, everyone. I'm Udit Maheshwari. I'm a practice dealer with the Everest Group and work with Rahul closely on helping clients and optimizing their software spend. I'm based out of India, but right now I'm in the UK, so I'm a little closer to Leonard than to Rahul, and enjoying this sunny day here in the port city of Dorset. Again, welcome all of you, and looking forward to a very meaningful conversation today.
Thanks, Udit. All right, let's get into the meat of the discussion then. So first of all, we'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk about why is this topic so relevant for organizations today. And the answer is simple. Given the current economic uncertainty, enterprises across the globe are closely looking at their IT spend and how to manage it best. Mostly, we see enterprises trying to achieve that by maximizing the savings from the outsourcing services side of the table, which, as we see, accounts for roughly about 25 to 35% of the overall IT spend for a typical enterprise. While actually it's software and hardware which accounts for a bigger chunk, roughly about 30 to 40%. Now, in spite of the smaller size, it is the outsourced services component which becomes the first choice for any kind of a scrutiny or negotiations that enterprises are targeting. Because in general, the overall fee structure is more transparent and easy to understand for the services part. In contrast, for software and hardware, the pricing typically ends up having kind of a black box nature, which is not easy for enterprises to understand. Hence, we see very few enterprises actually trying to be more efficient when it comes to their software and hardware spend. Another relevant point in this regard is that it's not as if, in line with enterprise objectives, the cost of any of these categories is decreasing. We'll actually share our perspective on the kind of price trends that we are observing for these categories. But I would just like to ask our audience to also chime in, now. If you are currently in renewal discussions for your software contracts, what kind of percentage increase in prices are your vendors asking you for? So if you could put in your responses into the chat window, that would be very helpful. Um, while the responses start coming up, I'll take a couple of minutes to talk about the trends that we are seeing, at least on the services side. So in the first half of 2023, we have seen labor pricing increasing by up to 2% for commoditized or traditional skill sets, while for next gen or specialized skill sets, we have seen it increasing by up to 3%. And as we look ahead, unless there is a widespread global recession, we do not really expect to see costs of services really coming down. Udit, would you like to take a stab at the current trend when it comes to pricing of software?
Sure, Rahul. So, like you really rightly said, Rahul, software spend optimization has been a topic that has been widely discussed within the IT and procurement teams. And primarily, the reason is because one, there is ambiguity around the pricing, and second, it's a non-standard matrix that each of the software provider uses for their own software, right? Now, given the current macroeconomic conditions that we are seeing, while the enterprises are focusing on achieving savings, software providers are also focusing on enhancing their profitability, and which is why we're observing major software providers like Microsoft, SAP, Oracles of the world going public and saying that they would be increasing the prices of their software from, let's say, about 5% to as high as 24 to 25%. And so that's one that we've seen the software providers saying out loud. The second observation that we have also gathered from our client conversations, looking at their current renewal proposals that the clients are receiving from their software providers, is that again, like across the board, the software providers, big and small, are pushing for a price increase. And the reason primarily is given is the hike in the employee wages, and also the current macroeconomic environment. So yes, I think it is high time that most of the enterprises, or even all of the enterprises, start thinking about how they can optimize their spend on software.
Leonard, do you agree with Udit's perspective, or any additional insights that you'd like to offer when it comes to how you are seeing uh, the pricing of different licenses change in the current situation?
Definitely. I see this in almost every single case we work on. It kind of feels like that most of the vendors use every single crisis for a price increase. And from an end user perspective, this is a really bad choice. But to be honest, from my perspective, it's actually a good thing, because now a lot of enterprises who never thought about software optimizing spend or use software business now start coming to us and see what we can do for them, how they can actually save some money on the licensing and without losing any functionalities.
Yep, fair point. All right. So given this high degree of price increases, the important question out there is, what can CIOs, what can business IT leaders or procurement leaders do to manage costs? In that respect, let's have a look at some of the typical levers, that are available for enterprises to manage their software spend. So if we kind of focus first on the three levers that are shown on the left side of this page. These are essentially levers which also form the basis of what Everest Group calls as the 3R framework, aimed at helping clients to reduce their spend on software. Uh, and basically, these are simple concepts. Reduce waste essentially means use all that you are paying for. Identify licenses, subscriptions that haven't been used for a long period of time, say a quarter, and then surrender them. or remove duplication in your IT applications landscape, and remove those applications that have very few users. The next is conduct profiling of different persona, who are using the software, and identify the right versions or editions of the software, that meets the requirements of different user persona, and then create an optimized bill of materials, so to say, for different software that you have. Udit, would you like to kind of talk about the remaining levers?
Sure, Rahul. So the next lever that we have is on the consolidating the requirement, and this is a lever that we've seen working in quite a few client engagements as well. So what we observe is that across the organization, there are multiple business units that end up buying software license on a piecemeal basis. So for a single client organization, there are multiple rates of the same software license that these business units end up agreeing with the software provider. So they should start consolidating the requirement and start negotiating from a central standpoint in order to gain better pricing and prices and pricing terms and conditions. The next lever that we think is helpful is exploring third party for support. So as we all know, the support from the OEM, which is the software provider itself, is is a little more expensive, and for certain applications which are not very business critical, enterprises can start exploring options of moving support to a third party. Now, one of the examples could be, let's say, moving IBM support for some of the IBM applications to third parties like Rimini Street, etc. The next lever is around SLA gold plating. This is not specifically only for software, but across the equipment used in IT. So not all applications would need the highest level of SLA support. The non-business critical applications could have a little relaxed SLAs, which would end up in reduced pricing for the enterprises. Last but not the least is controlling the spend via shadow IT. So which essentially means that these days there are a lot of subscription based products that individual departments end up buying themselves, and and the commercial or the procurement department doesn't have a lot of visibility into such spend. Now all of such spend, while it might be small in their own parlance, they add up, and the whole shadow IT spend just balloons up. So the enterprises should start thinking about it and start consolidating and reducing all of the shadow IT spend as well.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks for this explanation, Udit. Leonard, do you see some of these levers aligning with your experience as well?
Yes, actually, I see quite a lot of the levers, and we usually try to combine them when I look at right size requirement, reduce waste, consolidate requirement, and so on. What I see in many enterprises that their licenses purchased or subscribed are way too overdosed for their needs. And there's always a lot of room for optimization. For example, we kind of try to do different profilings to see which part of the company actually needs which type of services. And then we try to find the best way for the licensing. And for example, when they move to their subscription services with their licenses, it is most likely that they can sell their on-premise licenses, which kind of helps them to pay the first rent, as well as to work on their budget or to use the budget for some other services as well.
Right, right. Right, makes sense, Leonard. So just a note for our audience, if you have any questions on what all we have just discussed, so feel free to type them into the chat window. Uh, Preempting one of the questions that might be there in the minds of the audience, Udit, all of these levers conceptually make a lot of sense, right? But what kind of impact do they lead to in real life situations? Any specific take on your that you have on that?
Yeah, sure, Rahul. So I think, as I said, right, so not all of these levers that we spoke about would be applicable for each enterprise, but a combination or a mix and match of some of these levers and even some that we might not have just covered on the page, and which one of such levers is what Lena would speak about in the next section. I think a combination of these levers can surely help enterprises start get can help enterprises start on their journey on software spend optimization, right? Now we're not saying so one way of starting spend optimization is negotiating better prices with the supplier, but that is a long drawn process, and it includes, like, there is a dependency on the software provider. The levers that we spoke about here are more internal, and they are kind of best practices, if you may, right? Which the enterprises can start leveraging from day one. So if we so just to put things to, like, in perspective, these are, while they look good on paper, let's talk about one of the examples wherein we used some of these levers to help a big pharmaceutical client that the Everest Group was working with, in helping them optimize their spend on Salesforce, right? So the situation here was that the client was at the point of renewal, right? So they were looking at renewing their Salesforce contract across their business units. Now, as I said in the previous section, right? So they had approximately 100 plus contracts. Individual business units had signed up individual contracts with Salesforce for their multiple modules, which included Tableau, Heroku, etc. Right now, what we observed is that these contracts were non-standard in the sense that they did not have a uniform pricing for individual software licenses that most of these business units were buying, right? So the first and foremost thing that we help the client do is create a central view of what their spend looked like, and
Mhm.
putting in metadata from their multiple 100 plus contracts into a single sheet, or let's say an Excel dashboard, to understand what they were paying for each of their licenses. Now, it was a once we created that view, it was very easy for everyone to visualize that what is the least that they are already paying for that particular license. And if of course, like, it goes without saying that they needed to standardize the minimum price for their software license across their organization. So that was one. The second, of course, we help them in understanding whether the least prices that they were paying for their own software licenses, were they even in line with what we see in the market for similar sized enterprises. So we help them with price benchmarking of almost 85 to 90% of their bill of material, right? Which also help them in understanding the room for bet a negotiation in, if not at all 100% of their licenses, but in most of the licenses, right? Um, then, last but not the least, we also help the client in formulating a negotiation strategy. So, what are the vendor motivations? What could be used in active or real time negotiation to gain maximum impact, right? So, while we did all of this, the client was able to realize a savings potential of about 16% on their total spend. And given that this was a big contract with Salesforce, I think it was very important that they saw this opportunity and were able to realize most of it.
Right. I think a very important point that you mentioned, Udit, is that you know it, you really do not have a crystal ball, right? You cannot just look at a
Right.
contract and say that this is the contract, this is what the client is currently spending. Hence, there is room to optimize the spend by 15%, 20%. You really need to get down to the right level of detail. If the bill of material has 100 different line items, you need to be essentially in a position to benchmark almost all of them. Only then can you come up with a realistic number of what is the exact savings potential in a contract.
Right.
Um, So Udit and I have been doing a lot of talking, Leonard. I would like to, ask, you know, your perspective on something, which is a novel way of also looking at managing the spend that enterprises would have on software. The concept of using pre-owned software is something that not a lot of CIOs and sourcing folks are aware of. Could you explain that to us?
Yes, of course. Actually, in this chart, we see the four common scenarios. Pretty much every single enterprise can see itself somewhere on this picture. To keep it more simple, we gave these 4 different scenarios different names. So we have on-premise Pete on the ground, we got hybrid Henry on the stairs, Cloudy Jane in the clouds, and saving Stephanie on the way back to either hybrid Henry or to meet on-premise Pete. And when we start with on-premise Pete, for example, we see this a lot in European hospitals who do not feel like or do not want to go to subscription licenses, for example, M365, due to GDPR reasons. So what we can offer for them is either purchase a pre-owned software license, which is quite cheaper comparing to new, or if you done a renewal or a new rollout, sell your on-premise licenses that are not in use anymore. Another example for on-premise Pete, which is quite interesting, when we look at the Windows Server license, the Microsoft Windows Server, a lot of enterprises license the Windows Server with software assurance in order to have the new version, for example. But I would say in at least 4 out of 5 cases, maybe even more, the next version is usually skipped, and then they go to the version afterwards. For example, they were on 2012 R2, skipped 2016, and now installed 2019. Why am I saying this? They've been paying software assurance for 6 years. Microsoft announces in average every 3.5 years a new version, and the common enterprise agreement has a duration of 3 years. So by that I mean they are paying a lot of money for software assurance, which they do not need to, because it would be even cheaper with new licenses to purchase 2012 R2, and then when you want to go to 2019, purchase 2019, because there are not so many SA benefits who would or which would make the case to spend so much money. And the second one would be hybrid Henry. He wants to become cloud ready, but he knows he's now at on-premise level. He can't do everything at once. So the idea is to start with, for example, Teams, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, but the most expensive part is usually the Office. And a lot of the users do not need the Office online services. Therefore, the recommendation for hybrid Henry is to go with a hybrid model. Start with E1, an E1 plan, for example, and an Office on-premise. Even with a new license, it would be cheaper comparing to spending 3 years of E3 or E5 or whatever. To get to that, well, the levers I see or I use, I actually need to go into a deep analysis with the client, because I need to see what they've been using in the past, what they are using now, and what they want to use in the future. And then we can see where's potential to change their common infrastructure so far. And the more details I have, similar to what Rahul said about the Salesforce client, the more details we get, the better we can actually analyze it. And I prepared a case from an automotive industry supplier where we have actually 2 or 3 of the situations I shared in the beginning included. In 22, the client moved to E3, even though I recommended not to do so, but fair enough, that was his choice. We purchased his old Office 2019 licenses to help pay the first rent, and he moved to E3. So during the 3 years, we started the analysis of the usage of the services. And we came to the conclusion that we should use our, we call it traffic light system. I believe most of you have already seen these M365 maps which include all of the services and functionalities. I believe in an E5 plan there are more than 270 or so. And we use these maps, share them with the client, and then they should tell us which are the must-have services, which are the nice-to-have services, and which are not important. And it's actually quite interesting when we talk about these 200 whatever services, it's usually down to 3 or 4 very important ones and another few nice-to-haves. So in this case, we came up with several with several profiles. To summarize it, I just shared one important profile. He noticed that 2,000 of his users are really using the E3 services, all the online services, and it makes sense to keep them in an E3 plan. But the other 80%, and we talk about 8,000 users, do not use the Office Online functionalities, do not use the Windows virtualization, and so on. So therefore, we came up with the conclusion. We sign up for an E1 plan. We go back to Windows 10 on-premise with an LTSC and with a Windows Server 22 user cal. Because since these 8,000 users switched back from E5, the cals are not included anymore. All in all, we had a total of 4 different profiles, and during the contract terms, which were 3 years, the savings were around 3.3 million euros, which is quite nice.
Right.
And yeah.
That's a very solid kind of a use case to kind of a solid kind of a impact that you were able to yield for the client in this situation. And going back to your explanation on the previous slide, on a lighter note, really like the names that you have come up with. Hybrid Henry and Save Stephanie are really catchy.
Yeah.
One question which we have also kind of received, from Ricky. What are some of the risks clients need to be aware of, when using the use software? And I think especially with regard to the legality, is this in line with the laws that are prevalent in various regions?
It is, especially within Europe and the EEA, due to a judgment of the European Court in July 2012. And the court declared that the general sale and purchase of used software licenses is legitimate and legal, but you need to fulfill a lot of the requirements. For example, when we sell you used software licenses, you will see who was the initial owner, including contact details and so on. You will see the full license history, because we need to prove how the license entered the market. In the legal terms, it is said the first sale, and the first sale can prove the exhaustion. The license needs to be exhausted within the EU or EEA. Therefore, you will get a list from, maybe it can actually start before 2000, and then with the Office 97 LIC SA, and then you see the different renewals, the SA renewals, and to the newest version or the latest version they sold to us. And when you would like to sell us licenses, it's more or less the other way around. Then we need to go into the systems and check if the license chain is complete, and you need to declare that you're not using them anymore, and so on. So there may be actually a risk if you sign that you're not using them anymore, but you're still using them. That's definitely a risk. But usually when you go this way, for example, you move to the cloud, you already have the license right included for the previous version, and then it's an easy going.
Understood. And I don't want to bombard you with questions, but I think one more question which has come up is on similar lines. How would you really identify which of the services were being used by the client or not?
Actually, we did not have our own tool at that stage. We now are working on our own tool in cooperation with someone. But luckily, the client had a tool which actually showed him which services are in use. And it was as well a combination of talking to the IT team, which are the most of the services in use, because they could see this in the Active Directory, which services have been used. And this goes back as well to what I mentioned at the beginning. The more details we get, the better we can try to find a new profile which is cheaper comparing to the common E3 or E5 plan.
Understood. All right. Just flipping through some of the other questions which we have received. So there's a comment, uh, Udit. Unless SaaS, SAM management, spend analytics, contract management work in Unison, getting visibility and compliance and control will remain a challenge. Any perspective that you'd like to offer on that? You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Yeah. No, so I'm saying, Rahul, I think this is a fair comment, and we've seen this work, right? So all of these things have to go hand in hand for an enterprise to be called, or to be mature enough to actively and smartly manage their spend on software. But having said that, I think there's always a starting point, right? So if an enterprise doesn't have one or all of these components, still they can strive and start thinking about software spend optimization. So I think the first and foremost of all of this is to have a clear um, visibility on spend. And for that, I think what they can start doing is the contract management, and which might or might not be based on another software tool, but probably just in Excel but somebody working dedicatedly on it to keep a repository of all the contracts when the renewals are due for major contracts. I think keeping a track of renewal as well is very important because as we established the fact that software negotiations, software pricing is a little more tricky than the other IT subcategories, right? So once we know that a Microsoft contract is due for renewal in December, I think the enterprises, what we've seen the mature enterprises do is they start thinking about it or discussing about it actively, let's say 6 to 9 months prior to the renewal date. I think that should be that is one thing that the enterprises should start with as they start thinking about software spend optimization. But I think all the levers that we spoke about are more internal facing, as I already said, right? So even without much of an effort in the conversation in engaging the software provider, the enterprise can start their journey.
All right. Um, Makes sense. And I think another comment which came in was that some of these levers are only applicable in situations where the enterprise has a fair level of maturity, when it comes to having these kind of practices in place. I think that generally makes sense. At the same time, even if some of these things may not already be in place, there are ways to kind of get into a situation, and that those kind of, let's say, some certain types of analytics might not already be in place, but that's where specialist advisors, such as ourselves, could kind of come and step in,
Right.
quickly figure out, what is the total number of licenses that have been contracted for, what is the relative usage of all of them, is there any kind of roadmap that can be uh, that can be estimated, with regard to the future usage of different modules, the different licenses that exist. So while ideally all of these should be in place already, but even if not, it does not mean that the potential to realize the efficiencies goes away completely. Um, So that's an additional kind of perspective to offer. Another interesting comment which has come in from Abhinav, Salesforce generally does not work in account management mode unless client specifically asks. Um, and Tableau, MuleSoft, Slack teams operate differently than the Salesforce service. Yeah, I mean, while that definitely is correct, we have also seen a lot of instances where, let's say contracts for all of these different modules were signed separately, and there were different BUs or different departments which are kind of done, the contracting. Uh, I think one of the things that we wanted to emphasize as part of the discussion today is that a good chunk of savings can come, by consolidating, the different contracts that have been signed with the same vendor by different departments of an enterprise. So the moment you do that, a true picture emerges around what is the total spend, the total bill of material, as Udit put it, that one organization has with a particular vendor. And then, you can think about how to make that entire uh, consolidated a bill of material more optimized. Okay. Another question which has come up is what should you focus on while negotiating for a new software or a new application? Um, Leonard, any perspective that you'd like to offer on that particular question?
Well, maybe not during the negotiation phase because we are usually not involved in the negotiation and with the vendors. But what I always recommend is this a new application for the whole business, or is it only used for parts of the business? And is it really necessary to use this tool, or do I have already something similar uh, already in my within my contracts, and I'm just not aware of it?
Right. Udit, from your perspective, what are those important parameters to focus on?
Right. So Rahul, I think couple of things, right? So first is if it's a new application, the enterprise should create a view of what their current requirement is, and if the requirement it would increase in the future, and negotiate for for let's say a 3 year period and not just a 1 year period, because that in more often than not would end up in reduced per unit price for the license because of increased demand or a larger demand. I think that is one the enterprise should definitely look at. The second is to look at what is the vendor motivation or what are the things that they could leverage. So, for example, signing or negotiating the deals at the quarter end or a fiscal year end of the software provider might just help in getting extra 3 to 5% discount while negotiating, right? And third, if not already identified, is there any competition available in the market? If yes, the enterprise should also explore those. If not, then probably enterprise can also seek if not reduce price from this particular OEM, what are the other pricing terms and conditions benefits that they can reduce that they can get, probably like a relaxed payment term or a no termination fee, etc.
Makes sense, Udit. Thanks for that. We also wanted to let the audience know that we are offering a complimentary 30-minute session with our analysts to discuss how you can reduce your spend on Microsoft Azure contracts. So folks who are interested in signing up for such a session can click on the link that we are sharing in the chat window now. Okay. I think we're pretty much at the end of the the content that we wanted to kind of talk about in the session. Just one last question that we see: what segments of software buying market does Everest Group see moving to SaaS marketplaces? Um, Udit, any perspective that you'd like to offer on this?
I think Rahul, what we're increasingly seeing in client situation is products around human capital management. HCM is increasingly moving towards marketplaces. So I think that is one big area that I see moving towards SaaS based platforms.
Right. I think it's kind of following the footsteps of a lot of the traditional ERP, CRM kind of software, the workforce management, which was a large part of it was on on-premise
Right.
platforms. Now that's kind of moving to SaaS. All right. I think before we end the session today, Leonard, any final inputs, comments from you?
Well, no, but I would like to thank you and the audience. It's been a pleasure so far. And what I would like to add as well is that in case you have more questions afterwards, I'm of course available via LinkedIn, by mail, and so on. And usually we can, yeah, I'm a friend of keeping it as simple as possible for as long as possible. And it usually doesn't take longer than 15 to 20 minutes to roughly see if there are potentials for savings. And therefore, I can highly recommend to get in touch with me, and of course, to get in touch with the Everest Group, who are doing a very great job.
All right. So thank you very much for your time, everybody, who joined us today. Special thanks to you, Leonard, as well, for joining us and sharing your insights around pre-owned software. To folks in the audience, if you'd like to share this session with your colleagues or watch the session again, the recording would be uploaded on our website, as well as on YouTube. You could also reach out to us to discuss any specific questions that you might have. So thank you very much for your time today, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.